The sky burned with the fire of descending warships. From orbit, the Keth Dominion's fleet loomed like gods preparing to pass judgment, their obsidian hulls reflecting the dying embers of humanity's last bastion. Fortress Karen. General Adrian Holt stood on the shattered walls of the fortress, watching the swarm of enemy drop pods rip through the stormy night. The Keth had sent extermination squads before, but this time was different. This was the final culling. Inside the command bunker, her officers argued over desperate strategies. None of them mattered. The Warborn Covenant wasn't built to hide. It wasn't built to beg. It was built to kill. Holt turned to her second-in-command, Commander Darius Voss, who was leaning against a battered console, cleaning his blade with the detached calm of a man who had long accepted death. "How long until their main force lands?" she asked. Voss checked his tactical display. 15 minutes. Maybe less. The bastards think we're cornered. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. They're about to find out we bite. A low hum filled the bunker as engineers finished calibrating their last trick. An improvised electromagnetic pulse bomb scavenged from the remains of fallen Keth tech. If it worked, it would cripple the Dominion's ground forces long enough for a counteroffensive. If it failed, well, they would die either way. The War Council's murmurs fell silent as Holt stepped forward. She looked over her people, soldiers, scavengers, former farmers who had picked up rifles after their worlds burned. There were no civilians anymore. There was no home to go back to. She spoke with the voice of a woman who had nothing left to lose. This isn't a fight for survival. Survival is for the weak. We fight because we were born for war. The Keth think they've won, that they've broken us. She gestured to the burning sky. Let them come. Let them see what it means to stand against humanity. A roar of defiance erupted from the soldiers. Some slammed their fists to their chests. Others raised weapons high. It wasn't a cry of hope. It was a declaration of wrath. The Keth didn't know it yet, but tonight the gods would bleed. The first wave hit hard. Keth warforms, grotesque biomechanical creatures, crashed into the fortress in droves, their razor-sharp appendages carving through steel as they swarmed the outer walls. Energy lances from Keth enforcers cut through human lines, turning soldiers into piles of molten slag. The air was thick with the stench of burning flesh. But the Warborn didn't break. Snipers picked off Keth commanders with ruthless efficiency. Explosives buried in the rubble turned advancing squads into clouds of vapor. Voss led a charge into the thick of the enemy ranks, his blade slicing through Keth flesh, his pistol barking death at point-blank range. Then came the moment. The EMP bomb detonated in a surge of blue lightning, sending shockwaves through the battlefield. Keth energy weapons sputtered out. Their warforms seized, their towering war machines collapsed, leaving them vulnerable. Holt raised her rifle and bellowed the order. All forces, tear them apart. The Warborn stormed forward like an unchained beast. Humanity's counterattack had begun. The battlefield was chaos, exactly how the Warborn Covenant liked it. Keth warriors, stripped of their divine superiority, fought with desperation. Their energy weapons sputtered uselessly in their hands, forcing them to rely on physical combat. Against most species, their towering frames and razor-edged limbs would have been enough to rip through entire armies. But humans had always been different. Voss led the charge, his boots crunching over shattered Keth bodies. He ducked under a wild slash from a Keth warlord, twisted his blade into the alien's gut, and fired his pistol point-blank into its skull. The creature spasmed, its godly form collapsing into nothing more than meat. Holt moved with brutal precision, firing controlled bursts into the weak points of enemy armor. Around her, the Warborn Covenant fought with a kind of fury that no empire, no so-called god, had ever faced before. This wasn't a rebellion. This was extermination. And the Keth finally knew fear. The battle didn't last much longer. The Warborn tore through the remaining enforcers, pushing the surviving Keth back to their dropships. Some tried to flee, scrambling for their transport vessels, but the Warborn shot them down as they ran. There would be no retreat, no mercy. By the time the last Keth fell, Fortress Karen stood victorious. But there was no celebration. The humans moved with cold efficiency, stripping the battlefield of useful tech, dragging Keth bodies into the fires, reloading weapons for the next fight. There was always a next fight. Holt stood among the wreckage, breathing hard as the blood of a so-called god dripped from her armor. Voss approached, wiping his blade clean on the tattered banner of a fallen Keth warlord. We bought ourselves time, but that was just a fraction of their forces. The Dominion will send more. I know, Holt muttered. Her gaze locked onto a wrecked Keth transport, its cargo hold still intact. Something about it felt off. Check that ship, she ordered. The Warborn pried open the massive doors, weapons ready. Inside, a single Keth stood, taller than the others, its crimson armor marked with the runes of the High Dominion. But it wasn't armed. It was restrained. Shackles of shimmering energy bound its limbs, keeping it locked in place. A prisoner. Holt narrowed her eyes. A Keth prisoner. That was new. The alien lifted its head, dark eyes filled with hate. When it spoke, its voice slithered through the air like poisoned silk. You think you have won, it rasped. You have only ensured your extinction. Voss raised his weapon, but Holt held up a hand. Explain. The Keth let out something between a chuckle and a growl. You don't understand what you fight. The Dominion is not a kingdom. It is not an empire. It is a cycle. And you, humans, are simply another race too arrogant to see its place. Holt stepped closer. Then why are you in chains? The Keth's jaw tightened. For the first time, there was hesitation. Voss smirked. Looks like even gods have enemies. Holt considered the implications. The Warborn Covenant had just shattered a Keth assault force. But if the Dominion was truly a cycle, if there was something deeper beneath its rule, then maybe humanity wasn't just fighting an empire. Maybe they were fighting something far worse. The Keth prisoner knelt in the transport's dim interior, shackled by bonds of pure energy. It was taller than any other Keth they had encountered, its crimson armor marked with symbols Holt didn't recognize. Despite its restraints, there was no fear in its expression, only contempt. Holt crouched before it, her rifle resting on one knee. Tell me why your own kind locked you up. The Keth exhaled sharply, something between a laugh and a snarl. You believe yourselves warriors, but you are children playing with fire. The Warborn Covenant will burn, just as all before you have. Holt wasn't in the mood for arrogance. She drew her sidearm and pressed it under the alien's chin. I don't need riddles. I need answers. The Keth bared its fanged teeth. Then you will listen. It lifted its shackled hands as much as the restraints allowed, gesturing to the ruined battlefield outside. You think you've wounded the Dominion, but you don't understand what it is. We are not merely conquerors. We are sustained by those we rule. Voss leaned against the transport wall, arms crossed. Sustained. The Keth's dark eyes flickered toward him. We are not immortal by birth. We take what we need. Every species we subjugate, every world that kneels, feeds us, not in wealth, not in resources, in life. Holt's grip on her pistol tightened. Explain. The prisoner tilted its head. The Dominion's power is not divine. It is siphoned. For millennia, we have drained the life force of our conquered. The weak are culled, their essence turned into strength for the High Lords. That is why our rule never ends. That is why our power never fades. A heavy silence filled the air. Holt had seen the aftermath of Keth invasions, worlds stripped clean, entire populations vanishing. She had assumed it was mass execution, enslavement, or worse. But this, Voss exhaled through his teeth. So, you're nothing but parasites. The Keth's expression hardened. We are gods. Holt fired. The shot grazed just past the Keth's head, scorching the metal wall behind it. The prisoner didn't even flinch. No, Holt said coldly. You're afraid. She holstered her pistol and stood. "The Keth lock you up instead of killing you. That means you know something they don't want us to find out. And if you feed off the conquered, then that means we can starve you." The Keth let out a slow breath. "Foolish human, you cannot stop the cycle." Holt turned to Voss. "We're taking it back to Karen. Have the scientists tear every piece of knowledge from its mind." Voss nodded. "And after?" Holt met his gaze. "We burn the Keth down to their bones." As the Warborn prepared to retreat, Holt's mind was already moving ahead. If the Keth's strength came from their victims, then their weakness was clear. They had to break the siphon. If they could sever the Keth from their stolen life force, they wouldn't just weaken them. They would shatter them. Fortress Karen was a scar on a dying world. The last true stronghold of humanity stood atop jagged cliffs, its defenses patched together from the wreckage of fallen Keth warships. It had withstood countless assaults, but Holt knew that without a true plan, it was only a matter of time before the Dominion returned in force. Inside the Warborn's war room, a holographic projection of the galaxy flickered over a battered table. Red marks spread across the stars, Keth-controlled worlds, feeding their so-called immortality. If the prisoner was telling the truth, then every enslaved race in the Dominion was little more than livestock. Holt and Voss stood before the projection, along with Warborn strategists, engineers, and operatives. The Keth prisoner sat in restraints, surrounded by heavily armed guards. "So," Holt gestured to the hologram, "the Keth don't just rule. They drain. And that means they're vulnerable." Voss leaned forward. "If we cut them off from their life siphons, they don't just lose power, they wither." One of the engineers, Rane, shook her head. "But how do we even begin to sever it? We don't have their tech." Holt glanced at the prisoner. "We don't, but he does." The Keth's dark eyes gleamed. "You seek to steal the fire of the gods. You believe yourselves clever. But even if you succeed, you will only anger forces beyond your understanding." Voss smirked. "Good. I love pissing off gods." Holt stepped closer to the restrained alien. "Tell us where the siphon cores are, or we'll start tearing you apart piece by piece." The Keth exhaled slowly. "You do not frighten me." Holt smiled. "You misunderstand." She turned to Rain. "Hook him up to the neural extractor." A silence fell over the room. Even among the Warborn, the extractor was a feared tool. It wasn't just torture. It peeled a mind apart, extracting knowledge piece by piece, while leaving the victim's sanity in tatters. The Keth finally hesitated. "You would dare?" Holt crouched beside him. "I don't care what you think I would dare. You aren't a god. You're a parasite, and I will gut every last one of you." The Keth's jaw clenched. For the first time, a god had no choice but to submit. "I will tell you," he muttered. "But know this, once you touch the siphon cores, the High Lords will see you. And when they do, there will be no sanctuary left in the stars." Holt straightened. "We've never needed sanctuary." The prisoner revealed the locations of the Dominion's siphon cores, massive, hidden stations across the galaxy, feeding energy into the Keth warlords. If even one was destroyed, the Dominion would feel it. If they took them all, the gods would fall. Holt didn't waste time. "We need a strike team," she said. "Voss, take our best. Get inside one of those siphon cores and shut it down." Voss grinned. "Steal the fire of the gods. Sounds like my kind of suicide mission." The Warborn had their target. The countdown to the Keth's undoing had begun. The Warborn strike team moved through the void like wraiths. Their stolen Keth transport, painted in Dominion colors, slipped past the outer defenses of the siphon core, a massive station floating in the black, its spires pulsing with stolen life energy. Inside the cramped cockpit, Voss double-checked his rifle while Rain ran final scans of the structure. The siphon core wasn't just a power source, it was a prison. Tens of thousands of beings trapped in containment fields, their life force siphoned away in slow agony. "We're looking at a nightmare factory," Rain muttered. We shut this down. We don't just hurt the Keth. We set their victims free. Voss nodded. Then we burn it. The transport's docking clamps engaged with a dull clunk, and the Warborn spilled into the corridors, moving with silent precision. Their armor was blackened to blend with the station's shadows, their weapons ready to unleash hell. They didn't have the numbers for a prolonged fight, but they didn't need them. Speed, sabotage, and overwhelming force. That was how humanity survived. The first Keth patrol never saw them coming. The Warborn cut them down before they could even scream. Voss led them deeper, moving past containment chambers where aliens of all kinds floated in shimmering energy fields, their faces frozen in eternal suffering. The Sci-Fi core pulsed, feeding stolen life force into conduits that stretched beyond the station. To the Keth warlords, to the High Lords themselves. Voss set an explosive charge on the main conduit. 5 minutes until we ripped this place apart. Rain worked furiously at a control terminal, bypassing Dominion security. If I can hack the core's systems, I can shut down every containment field at once. We can give these people a fighting chance. Before Voss could respond, alarms blared. The Keth had seen them. Doors slammed open, and Dominion enforcers poured in, towering warforms with shimmering blades and plasma cannons. The Warborn dove for cover as the corridor exploded into chaos. Voss fired a grenade into the first wave, sending Keth bodies flying. Rain took a hit to the shoulder, but kept working. The rest of the Warborn laid down suppressing fire, but more enforcers were closing in. Voss activated his comm. "Holt, we're compromised. We need backup now." Holt's voice came through, calm but urgent. "Extraction team is inbound. Hold the line." A deep, guttural voice cut through the alarms. "You vermin think you can wound the gods." A Keth warlord stepped into view, larger than the rest, his body crackling with raw energy. Even with the Sci-Fi core compromised, he was still strong, still deadly. He raised a clawed hand, and a wave of kinetic force slammed into the Warborn, sending them crashing against the walls. Voss coughed up blood but forced himself to stand. He fired a burst straight at the warlord's head, only for the shots to stop midair, disintegrating in a crackle of energy. The warlord sneered, "You are nothing." Voss wiped blood from his mouth and grinned. "Funny. That's what the last guy said." Rain slammed her fist onto the terminal. Across the station, the containment fields collapsed. Thousands of prisoners fell to the ground, weak but alive. The station shuddered as the Sci-Fi core overloaded. And for the first time, a Keth warlord staggered. His stolen power was gone. Voss didn't hesitate. He surged forward, driving his blade straight into the warlord's chest. The alien gasped, eyes wide with shock, before collapsing in a heap. The Warborn had done the impossible. The gods were beginning to fall. The Sci-Fi core was in ruins. Fires raged through the station, alarms screaming as the Warborn strike team sprinted toward the extraction point. Behind them, thousands of newly freed prisoners staggered to their feet, confused, weak, but alive. Voss didn't slow down. He had seen enough battles to know that this wasn't victory yet. The Dominion would respond, and when they did, it wouldn't be with another fleet or another warlord. They would send something worse. "Rain, status on the core," he shouted as they rounded a burning corridor. She tapped furiously on her wrist console, still collapsing. "The overload will spread to the rest of the Sci-Fi network in this sector, but we need out before we go with it." Their stolen transport was docked in the main hangar, but it wasn't alone. A Keth dreadnought hovered just outside the station, its weapons glowing with unholy light. The Warborn barely had time to process it before a transmission crackled through their comms, impossibly deep and laced with fury. "You have severed the flow. You have defied the cycle. You will not leave this place." Voss cursed. "We've got a High Lord." The temperature dropped. The very air seemed to vibrate with an unnatural force. The Keth weren't just parasites. They were something older, something that had spent eons at the top of the food chain. Now, for the first time, they were starving. A rift tore open in the hangar. The High Lord stepped through. It was nothing like the others. Its form was fluid, shifting between solid flesh and something else. Something wrong. It didn't walk. It glided, its presence distorting reality itself. Energy swirled around it. Raw life force stolen from 1,000 dead species. Voss raised his rifle and fired. The rounds never reached their target. They disintegrated in the air, consumed by the High Lord's very presence. It spoke, not with words, but with a voice that echoed inside their skulls. You seek to unmake the eternal. Then you shall witness the wrath of the forsaken gods. The hangar erupted into chaos. The High Lord barely moved, yet everything around it shattered. The floor cracked, ships buckled. Warborn were flung like ragdolls against the walls. Voss hit the ground hard, his vision blurring. Holt's voice came through the comms. We're inbound. Hold position. Hold position. Against this. Voss struggled to his feet, coughing up blood. The High Lord turned its gaze toward him. And for a moment, he felt his own life being pulled from his body, as if his very existence was unraveling. Rain screamed, unleashing an energy blast from her stolen Keth weapon. It struck the High Lord dead center, only for the energy to be absorbed. The High Lord laughed. Voss gritted his teeth. He had fought monsters before. He had killed warlords, ripped through Keth enforcers, survived hell. But this wasn't just a monster. This was a god realizing it could die. And that made it the most dangerous thing in the universe. Voss staggered to his feet, every bone screaming in protest. The High Lord loomed before him, its shifting form radiating raw, stolen life force. The hangar was coming apart. Metal groaned, gravity flickered, and Warborn bodies lay scattered across the floor, struggling to move. The god had spoken of wrath. But Voss saw something else beneath its fury, a flicker of uncertainty, a hesitation it had never known before. It felt the loss of the siphon core. It was weaker. Rain coughed, gripping her side where the High Lord's attack had thrown her against a bulkhead. Tell me we have a plan, she gasped. Voss's mind raced. The Warborn couldn't kill this thing, not as they were. Every weapon they had, every trick they had used against the Dominion meant nothing here. But humanity wasn't built on gods and cycles. It was built on breaking them. He activated his comm. Holt, we need firepower now. Static. Then Holt's voice cut through the chaos. Brace for impact. A thunderclap split the void. The Warborn's capital ship, the Black Sun, dropped from orbit, its rail cannons already spinning up. The moment it locked onto the High Lord, the ship's main gun fired, an ultra-dense slug moving at near-light speed. It hit like the fist of an angry god. The High Lord screamed. For the first time, the Warborn saw it falter. Its form rippled, destabilizing, flickering between physical and ethereal. The sheer force of the impact sent it reeling, an impossibility for a being that had once called itself eternal. Voss didn't waste the moment. He grabbed the last high-yield explosive from his belt and sprinted forward. His body burned with exhaustion, his lungs felt like fire, but he moved. The High Lord turned, regaining form, and saw him coming. It lashed out. Voss dodged left, feeling the air itself warp past him. He leaped, slamming the explosive onto the god's shifting chest, right where its wounded energy pulsed like an open vein. The High Lord's eyes widened. Voss grinned through bloody teeth. Guess what? Gods bleed. He detonated the charge. A shockwave of unnatural energy blasted through the hangar. The High Lord convulsed, its form distorting violently. It screamed, but this time it wasn't fury. It was pain. The Warborn scrambled as the god thrashed, its body collapsing in on itself. The very fabric of space around it twisted, and for the first time in untold millennia, a High Lord of the Keth died. Voss hit the floor hard, vision blackening. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness Took him was the Warborn's dropship, swooping in for extraction, and the broken remains of the god vanishing into the void. The Dominion's greatest secret had been exposed. The Warborn had proven that the Keth were not immortal. And across the stars, every High Lord of the Dominion felt something they had never known before. Fear. The Warborn returned to Fortress Karen as legends. They had done the unthinkable, not just severing a siphon core, but killing a High Lord. Across the Dominion, the ripple effect was instant. The gods, once thought eternal, were now mortal. And mortals could die. Holt stood in the war room, watching a live feed of Dominion space. The Keth were panicking. Their once coordinated empire was fracturing, warlords turning on each other as power vacuums formed. Their fleets hesitated at the edges of human-controlled systems, uncertain. The fear of death had set in. Voss leaned against the table, his body still bruised from the battle. "I don't think they're coming back anytime soon." Rain snorted, "Not unless they want to be next." But Holt wasn't convinced. She turned to the Keth prisoner, the one who had revealed the secret of the siphons. He was still bound, but his arrogance had faded. "You knew this would happen," she said. The Keth exhaled slowly. "You misunderstand, human. You have not won. You have only set the stage for the end." Voss frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" The prisoner's dark eyes locked onto Holt's. "The Dominion did not always rule. We were not the first to wield the siphon. We only stole it from something older." His lips curled in something between a smirk and a grimace. "And now that you have broken the cycle, they will awaken." The room went silent. Rain clenched her fists. "More riddles? Give us something real, or we'll toss you back to your gods. What's left of them?" The Keth laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "The Warborn Covenant shattered the Dominion. But in doing so, you have shattered the seal that held the first gods in their graves." Holt's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. If he was telling the truth, then the Keth hadn't been the worst threat in the galaxy. They had been holding something back. And now, that prison was broken. She turned to her officers. "We prepare for war. We rally every free world, every species the Keth have ever conquered. We don't run. We stand." Voss grinned. "We tore down one set of gods. What's another?" The Keth prisoner shook his head. "You do not understand. You cannot fight what is coming." Holt met his gaze. Cold, unyielding. "Watch us." Across the galaxy, the Keth Dominion was crumbling. Their ships withdrew. Their warlords hid in the shadows, their power fading. But something else stirred in the void, something older than the Keth, older than any empire. For the first time in countless eons, the first gods turned their attention to the stars. And they saw humanity. They saw a species that had not just defied the cycle, but broken it, a species that had killed a god and laughed. The Keth had ruled through stolen life. But the Warborn Covenant had no need for stolen power. They had something greater: rage, defiance, and an unyielding promise that no matter what came next, humanity would not kneel. They would fight, and they would win.